Once upon a time, there was a little girl named
Angelina.
And this is a story about something that happened to Angelina's father during Easter when Angelina was 8 years old. You might remember from previous stories that Mrs. Goodwin was a devout Catholic and very active in her church, and Angelina was raised up in the same. Mr. Goodwin was not so much. While he was certainly not disrespectful to people that went to church, he was kind of unsettled in his mind about going to church. But he would show up, if you remember the Christmas story, he would get dressed up, and he always showed up, he'll call it all the big ones, all the significant church holidays. Well, in the Catholic Church, they made quite a ceremony out of Holy Week, the week before Easter. And this one particular time, they had a lot going on in their family. That Mrs. Goodwin had a lot of outside the home responsibilities. She was helping to care for some of her elderly neighbors. Mrs. Anderson, you remember Mrs. Anderson that took care of Skippy? Mrs. Anderson was bad off sick with diverticulitis, and her husband was a hopeless alcoholic, so he was no help. Mrs. Goodwin was kind of stressed out, and her schedule and all of her commitments caused her to miss some of the church services. So she kind of put the arm on Frank, her husband, to go to church with Angelina, because she said, I don't want Angelina to miss any of the ceremony, any of the services. I want her there for Ash Wednesday, Monday, Thursday, Good Friday. You got to go tomorrow. So Mr. Goodwin was, pretty cheerful about it, and not too many people knew this, but he had a terrible, terrible abscess tooth that it just would bother him. He had some bad dental work when he was a kid, and every now and again the thing would get abscessed and just drive him crazy. So it got so bad that he had to take this prescription pain medicine that was narcotic. And he could handle it pretty well, but every now and again it made him kind of giddy. And so, sure enough, he was eating Easter candy, bit down on something, and made this thing flare up. So his face was like a little bit swelled up. But he took some of his pain medicine, and he went to church on Monday, Thursday with Angelina, and he was all dressed up in his suit. And Angelina sang in the choir, so they had kind of a little, some hymn singing and some things that they did. And Mr. Goodwin was sitting, he didn't like to sit too far in the front. So he was kind of middle row, and he always sat on the right. Because like your dear old granddad, he was not sighted in his right eye and all but deaf in his right ear. So he kind of had to be like this to see and hear good. And he came in, and church is pretty crowded, it's pretty well attended, and people are coming in, and here comes this lady. He knew her, but he didn't know her name. But she was kind of like a stout woman, pretty good size. And when they got up to sing, this lady, she stood up and she had this kind of silky looking dress on. And she got up and the dress was stuck in her ass crack. So, he was just trying to be polite and just, reached over and pulled it out of her ass crack. And she turned around and wham! Nailed him a good one, right on his sore jaw. He fell back in the pew, the tears were streaming down his cheeks. And she's like, there was church, so they couldn't make too much of a scene. So he's like this, and she's staring daggers at him. And he's so nothing really happened, they just kind of went in. And Angelina didn't see any of this. So he came home, and Mrs. Goodwin was all busy and stressed out. And she's like, Frank, she said, what in God's name happened to your jaw? And he said, well, it happened in church. And she said, well, what's the matter? He said, oh, it's just my tooth. It'll be fine. I'm just going to take some more medicine. And she's like, well, I don't know about all this. And he said, well, don't worry about it. He said, it'll be fine. So they went to bed, and the next day was Good Friday, and so they had the Good Friday service, and Mrs. Goodwin was still committed to her sick neighbor, Mrs. Anderson. So she said, Frank, it's going to be on you, bud. You got to go back to church with Angelina. and I want to make sure that you attend, you know, the entire Good Friday service. So he's like, okay, he's going to take his medicine like a man, goes back in, sits in the same place, and damn if that lady didn't come back in. Sat right down in front of him and wearing the same kind of flowery dress. So she comes, stands up to sing, and the dress was, well, it wasn't stuck to her ass crack. So Frank reached in and put it back in. She turned around and belled him again. This time, boy, she put a whipping on his eye. By the time he got home, it's all discolored. He was swollen shut. He could hardly see. The lady, like, she was starting to make a scene. She seen him outside and he was screaming. She said, if you touch me again, I'm going to call the cops. And Angelina, I couldn't figure out what's going on. And so, but he came home and there was like no way he could not tell his wife what happened. So she's like, Frank, what in God's name happened to your eye? He said, it happened in church. She's like, what? He said, well, you remember when I went from Monday Thursday service? He said, this kind of big lady was got up in front of me, and I saw that her dress was like stuck in her ass crack. So I wanted to be a gentleman, and I just reached to pull it out. And he's like, what the hell did you do that for? And she said, well, what did she do? She would turn around and smack me. And she's like, well, God, I hope so. And then she said, well, what? So now why do you have a black eye? And he said, well, I went back for the Good Friday service, and Angelina was singing, and everybody got up to sing the hymns. And I saw that the lady didn't have it stuck in her ass crack, and I knew she liked it, so I went to put it back. So, Mrs. Goodwin said, I think we've had enough church for the week. And they decided that instead of just needed to clear the air and get away from each other, so Frank decided to stay home and watch television and drink beer. And Mrs. Goodwin and Angelina went out to eat at Harold Johnson's. Angelina got what she always got. Mrs. Goodwin, they served alcohol, and she decided she needed to stop on the way home for a little fortification. And when they got home, Skippy had been inside all day, and given all the other excitement, he didn't get a chance to go out. So as soon as he heard the car, she started in with that barking. And he got so excited, guess what he did?
Beat on the rug!
The end.